Hi, and welcome to today's webinar on electric vehicles in the South African market. I am Nicolette Pomba-van Zyl, editor of ESI Africa and your moderator for today's discussion. Hosted in collaboration with African Utility Week and PowerGen Africa, taking place on the 12th to the 14th of May 2020 in Cape Town, where this hot topic will also be covered. Bloomberg predicts that by 2040, 1 in every 3 new cars sold globally will be an electric vehicle. However, in South Africa, there are currently only about 1,000 to 1,500 on our roads. Joining me on air are 4 professionals who are ready to provide insight and answer your questions on the race to capture the EV market in South Africa. I am pleased to welcome Brian Hastie, Chairperson of the EV Subcommittee at the National Association of Automobile Manufacturers of South Africa, Hittan Parmar, Director of Hilo e-mobility program in South Africa, Nick Singh, who is the head of the Smart Grid Center of Excellence at Eskom. Also from Eskom, we have Daryl Chapman, the e-mobility project manager. Listeners, please take note that you will have access to their recording and PowerPoint presentations after the broadcast, which will be on our website, esi-africa.com. To ask our guests a question, use the Q&A box on the left-hand side of your screen. Also, to find out more about Brian, Hittan, Nick and Daryl, the African Utility Week and PowerGen Africa Conference, or myself, you're welcome to toggle through the tabs at the top of your screen. For those of you just joining us, welcome. Now down to business. To start off the discussion, our guest speakers have prepared an opening statement. I'd like to ask Nick to please take over his presentation slide, which will look at the smart grid perspective. Nick, over to you.
Thank you. Good day, everybody. Thank you for this opportunity to be part of this dynamic topic of discussion. I'm actually quite excited to hear everyone's thoughts and views on the topic. I believe that the transition of consumers to the prosumer will lead to an energy system such as rooftop PV and energy storage, whether they take the form of power banks or power walls, and whether they take form of electric vehicle becoming more prominent within the public sector. So when we think of natural resources, many overlook the fact that South Africa has an average of more than 2,500 hours of sunshine a year, ranking in the top 3 in the world. So it's perfect for solar investments. When one combines these irradiation figures with the decreasing cost of photovoltaic systems and inverter technology, the result is a very different customer profile from that of yesteryear. And as this energy landscape is changing, so too must utilities follow suit by adapting and adjusting traditional business models to embrace this very disruptive technology and make it work to its favor. So the aspiration for the smarter grid has seen a significant increase in the presence of DER, including the likes of plug-in electric vehicles within our distribution networks, making them an integral part of the networks of the future. So the impact of vehicles to grid and vehicle to home interactions will have significant impact on the utility grid, both positively and negatively. And understanding this impact and influence on the grid and home alike is necessary to determine how we manage these new resources. So, Nicolette, the slides are live, so the guys can see that, correct?
That's right. Everyone can see your presentation.
Okay, fantastic. So on the slide that I'm on at the moment is an example of a vehicle-to-home integration that we are busily demonstrating at our facilities, with the intention of trying to use the infrastructure to leverage electric vehicle charging and to perhaps use the battery for vehicle to home. And ultimately, it's Eskom's aspiration to have system visibility so that the safety and the interlocks to facilitate this management is achievable, so that the system operator has oversight and control potential to manage supply and demand in real time. And we all know that, the customer is moving towards customer centricity with diverse energy mixes and web portals and app access to do appliance control devices, and including Internet of Things and other system control as they evolve into a prosumer. Okay, so I think that's a summary of what I want to talk about.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Nick. Hiten, I'd like to now ask you to give your opening statement from an e-mobility perspective. Your slides should be up now.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to share some insights on this afternoon around a very relative topic that we see happening globally, as well as already transitions within South Africa. So, if we take a national viewpoint and a country perspective extending beyond the National Development Plan of 2030, the Green Transport Strategy of National Department of Transport was released in November 2018. And that really provides a strategy of commitment from government towards 2050 on decarbonizing the transport sector. What that highlights is that out of the 10.8% of emissions from the transport sector, 91.2% are from road transport, primarily from the combustion of petrol and diesel. So what that highlights is that South Africa's current fuel mix, as well as supporting vehicle technologies that need to be matched towards that, are then contributing to greenhouse gas emissions that we see within that. And within that policy framework, we then see specific targets of improving the transport system, achieving modal shifts, reducing fossil fuel-based reliance within the transport sector, as well as promotion of electric vehicles and sustainable low-carbon fuels within that. And really, it's about improving strategies for delivering an transport infrastructure in improving that. So if we expand around that and take the next perspective, so if we understand South Africa's policies and regulatory frameworks in South Africa that specifically speak to electrification of transport, beyond that, the country is signatory to the Paris Agreement and also the National Climate Change Response Strategy, which guides both the public sector and private sector towards contributing towards carbon reduction around that. There are existing policy instruments that try to incentivize buyers to move away from emission-heavy vehicles. However, this is reliant around also the advocacy from the OEMs about these aspects to be able to enlighten the consumers on those aspects. So these are the specific highlights on where we see developments in South Africa on that context. So if we expand on that and unpack the automotive industry, what is understandable is that the automotive industry in South Africa is quite a strong industry. In 1924, the Model T production began in Port Elizabeth. And in that year, South Africa manufactured 30,000 vehicles. So since then, the automotive sector has been a strong manufacturing sector in South Africa. With that, it's said that a lot of the manufacturing is based on internal combustion engines, mainly petrol and diesel vehicles. We haven't seen the transition from a manufacturing perspective into electric. And then this spills over into the Automotive Production Development Program, which is the automotive policy regime that drives incentivization in this specific sector. And currently, one of the challenges we face in trying to promote adoption of electric vehicles is the current duty framework on internal combustion engines and electric vehicles, to which electric vehicles are currently taxed at about 25% from the EU versus 18% for petrol vehicles on that context. And extending on that, since South Africa's manufacturing environment is around passenger vehicles, the policy regime also speaks to incentivization or enabling framework for light-duty vehicles, typically under 800 kgs, which track 0% duty, as well as enabling environment for vehicles above 3,500 mass, as per the slides around that context. In just taking a holistic overview, there was a macroeconomic study done within South Africa on that context, and I think the high-level viewpoint around the adoption of electric vehicles is the context of there will be winners and losers around that context, but I think one of the main highlighting points is that the automotive industry worldwide is going through a revolution, and South Africa is not within isolation of that. We certainly align towards that. And one of the points highlighted within that is that if we transition to Euro 6 level vehicle technology and supporting fuel quality, it then moves to only providing a 12% saving on greenhouse gas emissions. However, if we move to electric vehicles and with our 93% reliance on Eskom, from a coal generation capacity, it already provides a 34% saving in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. However, if we move to renewables, obviously then this increases to 67% in terms of that contribution. So that's what we see within that. These are very high-level overviews from the infrastructure landscape that represent South Africa, both from a national perspective as well as a city perspective, as well as the landscape of electric vehicles, both hybrid electric vehicles since 2005, plug-in electric vehicles since 2015, and battery electric vehicles since 2013, right up to, since initial market introductions, up to June 2019. So if we look at, from a holistic technology viewpoint, it's not just about vehicles. It's about the ecosystem that we see, harmony, integration of the technologies. We need to get the standards. We need to get the components. We need to support the OEMs. We need to look at mobility options from the consumer, driving skills development, and batteries recycling and second life as well. So that's, if we take a holistic viewpoint from the EV sector, that's really what it presents. As a snapshot, that's the introductory slides and statements around that.
Thank you so much, Heaton. I know that, for instance, in Europe, a green number plate indicates an EV car, which comes with benefits of using a bus lane, and that's something that we should think about as well as drivers. Brian, I'd like to ask you to now please give your opening statement. Your slides should be up now.
Hi, good afternoon, thanks. Well, the EV story is one which truly is a global one, and we have seen the rise of EVs in international markets grow exponentially over the last couple of years. And what is really pertinent is the fact that it's not only in one market, but it is in China, in Europe, in US, and has reached a momentum which one must really consider as being unstoppable. This year alone, more than 20 new model ranges, which are full EVs, will launch in the European market. And that number is set to become 400 new models within the next 3 years. So the momentum is really gathering on a global scale. It's still in the relatively early stages, because the number of EVs sold as a proportion of total vehicles sold is still just below 3% on a global basis. But that figure is set to rise to 11% by 2025. And by 2040, the various figures predicted that anything between a third and a half of cars sold would be EVs. So from a global point of view, most definitely the momentum is there. From a local point of view, the picture is a little bit different. And I'll bring up the local data contrasting the global data at the top of the slide. We've actually seen an overall decline in EV sales over the last number of years. And that is simply model life cycle dependent. The reality is that we've had very, very few EVs launched in the market, more plug-in hybrids at very low volume, and full battery cars really has just been the Nissan Leaf, which was available already from 2015, but the new model is not yet in the South African market. The BMW i3 and most recently the Jaguar I-Pace has joined the market in 2019. So in reality, we see a absolute opposite trend in terms of that EV growth. It has to do with the lack of models launched and diversity of models launched within the South African market. So we've got a very limited number choice. So far, it's only been from the premium brands, and the local importers and OEMs are simply not able to market the EV successfully right now, and that's a major concern. So contrasting to the global uptake, we are actually on a trajectory in the bottom right of that graph at the moment probably representing the grey line, which is just having very little uptake. If we had to keep pace with the global uptake, we would follow the blue line, getting to about 40,000 EVs by 2025. And the reality is we'll probably land up somewhere in between. But I think we need to look into the reasons behind the lack of viability of EVs. Hitten touched on it in his introduction, and that is the import duties. So a full battery electric vehicle actually has a higher import duty from Europe than its equivalent internal combustion engine. And that's a crazy situation. It drives the price of the vehicle up, which is compounded by ad valorem duty and VAT. The overall result is that EVs are more expensive than the equivalent ICE car. The result, obviously, because the cars are more expensive, is reduced demand. Consumers are looking at this. They're looking at a new technology. They're looking at something that's not yet completely proven. It's a technology, unfortunately, that has got a lot of myths around it, a lot of misinformation. Early generation electric cars didn't have a very big range and didn't create a lot of confidence in the technology. That has moved on, and the second generation EVs really have got highly usable range. But the fact is that the consumer needs to be convinced. And when he's faced with a higher price and new technology, the result of that is low demand and low uptake. So, our local market development is mismatched to the global markets. And this poses all kinds of risks for the South African vehicle market. One of it being the future of the vehicle production and export business. But it's not good for the country from a greenhouse gases perspective, from a local market and modernization perspective, and from an industry perspective. So we are very concerned as industry that we need to address the core issues and turn the situation around in order to keep up with the global swing towards EVs.
All right, thank you so much, Brian. I think you have addressed a number of questions that have come through during the pre-registration, which I know we will unpack further later in the webinar. Cyril, if you'll please give your opening statement, and your slides should be up now.
Thank you, Nicolette, and hello, everyone. Yes, I'm the e-mobility project manager at Eskom, as mentioned earlier. And yeah, at Eskom, we are, if I can just move to the next slide, we have quite a long history of working in the electric vehicle space, with research going as far back as the 1990s. So this is certainly not a new area of focus for us, but most recently we've seen this move internationally in the global market towards electric vehicles, and so Eskom has realized that this is possibly a potential for a potentially new revenue stream for the utility. And we also would like to play our part in supporting this transition to cleaner mobility. So the e-mobility team is ready to support efforts to increase the uptake of EVs in South Africa. We have also, at our research facility, done some modeling of what we believe would be the potential uptake of electric vehicles in South Africa in the local market. And our model, amongst other things, looked at current trends locally and internationally, and it also considered the relative gross domestic product, the GDP, our GDP relative to other markets where there are electric vehicles entering those markets. And through that modeling, we've determined that there's in the order of about 234,000 vehicles that would come on the road by around 2040. Now, one of my co-presenters, Brian, would probably say that that's a very conservative estimate, and perhaps it is. But as I said, that's how it was modeled according to the factors that we had available to us. And so the next question that is often posed to us is, what exactly does this mean for our national grid, for electricity grid in South Africa? If you have a look at the blue line on the table, you will see that 234,000 electric cars that we say would be on the roads by 2040, and using a number of assumptions, we come to only an increase in annual energy demand of about 0.5%, 0.45%, if you want to be more accurate. And so it's not a massive additional load onto Eskom's grid. It's certainly, we believe it would be manageable. And if we went to change out half the current number of registered vehicles or cars in South Africa, it would only increase our annual energy demand by about 7% using that same set of assumptions. So it's certainly manageable, but it is something that we are interested in working on for the South African market. The other question that would typically come up is around the reliability of our supply in Eskom. So we are all aware of the current challenges faced by Eskom, both in terms of their financial performance and also in terms of the actual technical side of providing energy to the market. And so I'm regularly asked about load shedding and problems during peak periods and so on. And we honestly don't believe that this should be a barrier to EV adoption in South Africa. Load shedding we have typically seen is quite predictable, and not for extremely long duration. So you could certainly, if you did some forward planning, you could do your charging of a vehicle within the available time. So if you were out for 2 hours in a day, there's plenty of additional hours that you could charge a vehicle in. So we don't see that as a problem. And in terms of the peak loading, smart charging can also be used to avoid charging during peak periods. So yeah, we certainly see a lot of potential for electric vehicles in South Africa, and we're very positive. We would like to play our part in supporting that market and providing the energy to go with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Daryl. Listeners, we have a survey question that we'd like to pose to you to get your thoughts on what are you most concerned about in purchasing an EV. Is it the current price? Is it the availability of charge points or EV battery performance? Please take the survey now. Listeners, also a reminder that the PowerPoint presentations will be made available to you on our website, which is esi-africa.com. And if you have a question for our panel members, please pose it in the Q&A box. We have received quite a number of questions from the pre-registration, and we have selected from that as well for our panel to respond to. And the first question I'd like to pose to Brian, and this question is, which strategies should government adopt to promote EV sales in South Africa?
Thanks, Nicolette. Well, the first priority is to normalize the duty rate at very least. So 25 percentage points down to 18 percentage points. And we're talking about the European import tariff, but at this stage, most production of EVs is European. So that's very, very relevant. However, incentives are also a priority. And we think that we need around a 5-year window in order to stimulate the uptake. And the rationale is this. The production cost of EVs will reduce greatly with a volume increase. And this is a global scenario. And therefore, we need to stimulate the uptake in order to grow the volume. And from a certain point, incentives are no longer necessary because cost parity with EVs will have been achieved. And at the same time, income from the EV ecosystem. So by that I mean charge point installations and sales, tooling required to support EVs, training and competency in order to support EVs. Those revenue streams from the EV ecosystem will also bring additional incremental money into the economy. And so we're keen to look at a system which is workable and rational and fair in order not only to normalize import duties, but to support an incentive scheme in order to stimulate the uptake of EVs, in order to create a consumer proposition. And we see that as being key.
Thank you so much, Brian. Ethan, we have a question for you, and that is whether legislation, taxes, charging infrastructure, etc., is the main obstacle to EV adoption, or is the South African consumer just not ready for EV, assuming that pricing was comparable to the IC engine?
Yeah, so certainly I think it's a given that there's a lack of awareness around both consumers, government role players, as well as industry around driving the EV sector uptake around that. When you speak about comparable to ICE engines, the global perspective has been brought a lot closer. It was initially 2028, 2025, but the recent statistics at a global level is saying that cross parity between ICE and EV is going to be from 2020, which is next year. So at least from a global perspective, that's what we're seeing. However, as Brian and myself and the general insight shared in the opening statements, South Africa's enabling environment is challenged on the basis of the import duty frameworks that are applied specifically to EVs on that context. But that, again, as highlighted, is on the basis of the strong manufacturing environment, which was currently intensive on petrol and diesel vehicles, and we need to see that shift. In terms of infrastructure, again, it's a perception of lack of awareness out there until one actually knows, like the insight shared in the opening statement, around what infrastructure is available already. We then have that already, the awareness created around that. And the perception about range anxiety is also challenged around that. And I think also once consumers have the EV experience, until they drive in an EV and have that exhilarating performance and driving experience around that, it's then an exciting journey around that. And once you embrace that, it's also understanding that majority of charging actually takes place at home. So 60 to 70% of the time you're actually charging at home when your vehicle is lying idle. And that's again understanding that whole operating model of electric vehicles. But certainly I think each country has its role to play in enabling environment, both on infrastructure, from consumer awareness, and again, holistically working with all role players in the industry around creating an enabling environment for the adoption of electric vehicles.
Thank you so much, Ethan. Brian, we have another policy question, which is, what are the key policies that need to be implemented in South Africa that can accelerate this industry?
Yeah, so I think the key policies really come down to the consumer proposition. So to stimulate the demand, we need a price point of the vehicles, and we need a spread of vehicles across mass manufacturers as is available in Europe and other parts of the world. So it's a little bit of a chicken and egg situation, and we as industry are working and talking to government and are undergoing considerable research in that area in order to demonstrate what is needed with regards to duty and incentive support in order to create that price point. At the right price point, I think the consumer will adopt, and once they have a level of momentum, the consumer will realize that these cars are fantastic to drive, because they really are. They've got great performance. They're very comfortable because of the sound, and the uptake will then start to gain real momentum. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Brian. So, Hitton, what is the government's plan for South Africa's transition to green transport?
Yeah, so just, reflecting back on the opening statement. So, if we take a country's perspective, and there's always a vision document or vision insights that's set, and within South Africa, that speaks to the National Development Plan of 2030. And with that, it speaks to a sustainable economy, a carbon-free economy, and as well as in transport, sustainable transport and emission-free transport on that context. So if we expand on that, the recent Green Transport Strategy that was launched in November 2018 is a document or policy framework that's being provided in South Africa towards decarbonizing, specifically highlighting the transition to electric vehicles and decarbonizing around that aspect. But on that aspect, we also need to be relative to the African perspective. While internationally we are seeing direct financial incentives that are being passed to consumers to offset the upfront costs, that's through revenue that these international governments have within that. However, in the African context, and South Africa is not alone to that, government financing has always been a challenge towards service delivery and other challenges that we need to meet. So in the context of direct financial incentives, it's still a question mark on whether we see South Africa, and not only South Africa, Africa being able to provide those direct financial incentives. However, there is a role for government to play in terms of non-financial incentives. And this is what we need to unpack, like Brian mentioned, that there are conversations ongoing with the relative stakeholders, is to try and drive an enabling framework in South Africa. So certainly from the Green Transport Strategy, that speaks to that. And it's about working together, both with industry and government, on how do we create a better enabling environment in South Africa to provide electric vehicle options for the consumers.
Thank you so much, Ethan. We've also had a lot of questions from the audience in terms of infrastructure and market-related for EV uptake. So I have a question for Nick. What infrastructure is necessary to facilitate the uptake of electric vehicles?
Thanks, Nicolette. I believe that plug-in electric vehicles will require significant investment to upgrade our existing infrastructure to accommodate these large charging loads. For example, the old Leaf, if I'm not mistaken, was a 22 kilowatt-hour battery, and the new Jaguar, I think, is in excess of very close to 90 kilowatt-hours, and these are massive loads. So the infrastructure will include, possible line operating, transformer operating, as well as how do we facilitate public charging infrastructure and payment methods. Now, we all know that, IoT, Internet of Things, and communications will play a large part of this new infrastructure. And one of the crucial layers in any smart grid is communications and cybersecurity. And as soon as one introduces points of sales or, remote charging with billing, factors like this become very, very important. So there's a lot to do in this infrastructure space.
Thank you so much, Nick. Daryl, we have a question for you around, do you think EV conservation, retrofitting of conventional vehicles, will play an important role in kickstarting the EV industry in South Africa or even other African countries?
Well, initially, I don't think that conversions are going to play a significant role. If we look at other EV markets and how those have developed, I strongly believe that the kickstart will come more from the availability of a variety of more affordable models, both in entry-level and mid-range models. I think retrofitting might be more of an option for something like the taxi industry in the future.
All right, thank you so much. Brian, do you want to add to that?
Yes, thanks. I just want to add that the modern vehicles are really sophisticated, integrated units with integrated electronics. Consumers have become used to anti-skid control, ABS braking systems. The engine management systems are integrated into all of these, and they're not designed as a plug-and-play unit. So apart from some very specialist niche conversions done by very highly qualified people, they're just not practical. And so conversions of very old cars will be conversions which are to cars which don't have the modern safety systems, and conversions to more modern cars are just not feasible.
So taking that into consideration, do you see the possible development of a new small-scale industry from the conversion of petrol diesel vehicles to EV?
No, I don't. I just think it's not. It's very niche. It would be akin to the hot rod conversion industry for the enthusiast market. It's just simply not practical for mainstream. I think the consumer's looking for good, reliable products, and those are available from many manufacturers currently, and many more to come within the next short few years.
Thank you so much, Brian. Nick, we have a question on how do we realistically introduce EVs to the developing world without first dealing with erratic power supply? If you can please respond to that question.
I can. Erratic power supply has been, with us for a while, and it is frustrating. But Eskom is also looking at how do we move forward as a company, looking at distributed energy resources. So I want to answer this question in a slightly different way. I want to suggest an alternative solution where we could actually use DER infrastructure to alleviate the loading of distribution network infrastructure. So what I'm saying is that I envisage a solution that will include your PV and smart inverter installations in residential, commercial, industrial sectors that will offset a portion of the loading of the national grid by utilizing the energy generated from these renewable systems to power that respective sector, as well as to use the same infrastructure to charge a PEV during the day when the sun is available, and then leverage the same infrastructure that can now transform the stored PE plug-in electric vehicle battery energy that the vehicle possesses to be utilized within the house or exported onto the national grid if or when required. So, that's my perspective on this. As I said, I answered in the first question, there's a lot of infrastructure that will be required from a smart grid perspective that will include your traditional charging points, etc. But this is another option going forward.
Thank you so much. Brian, we have a question for you around how do we overcome the range anxiety problem in South Africa? Charging stations are few and far between, and the recent challenge from Joburg to Cape Town has not placated these concerns. What is your response to that?
Firstly, the range of the latest generation EVs really is usable. So up to 470 kilometers on the Jaguar I-Pace I can speak to, but well above 300 kilometers with higher speed driving, with higher loads, etc. So to Hitton's point earlier, an overnight home charge is the most convenient and the cheapest form of charging. Setting off from home with a full charge for general use, that 300 plus kilometers is more than enough. I will say that for longer trips and for day trips, it is essential to have a public network. And we, in fact, have got a very much advanced public network, given the number of cars on the road. There are less than 50 EVs to every charge point right now, which is a great ratio by international standards. The recent trip to Cape Town, in fact, did not make use of an existing grid which was in place, but it made use of chargers which were specifically installed on a temporary basis, some of them for the actual trip. Had they made use of the existing backbone that was there, as well as the chargers which were part of the EVRT trip, the charging wouldn't have been an issue if some people had those issues. So one can travel down the N1 to Cape Town from Gauteng, down the N3 to Durban, down the N2 between Port Elizabeth and Cape Town, and it is generally usable and doable. Obviously, the grid needs to grow. and in fact it's growing on a continual basis. We're seeing it just becoming more and more usable. I don't think that's the big issue. There's a couple of hundred EV users using their cars currently, and I think overall range anxiety is something that you become very accustomed to. In terms of, you become accustomed to the car's capabilities and you become accustomed to your routines. And I don't think it's as big an issue as what it was in the beginning.
Thank you so much, Brian. Hitton, do you have a response to that question as well?
I think it's relating to the range anxiety issue around that, and I think it's once consumers are more aware of what's out there, and even the current footprint that we have for plug-in electric vehicles and existing infrastructure, it's a well-balanced ratio for South Africa in its current context. As we see the growth, it's a natural progression that infrastructure will grow around that. And as shared earlier, is that majority of the charging actually takes place at home. So, once people are aware of this and start embracing it, certainly there will be, they'll understand the operating model around that. And again, that will just provide better insights into increasing the transition to electric on that side.
Thank you so much. Listeners, I'd like to give the survey results to you. Coming out very strongly at 67.44% are concerns around import taxes and duties. At 27.91% is the availability of charge points. And then at 9.35%, we have EV battery performance. So I'd like to then pose a question which comes from one of our audience members to Daryl. And what are plans from government to reduce import duties and even subsidies?
Well, Nicolette, I can only speak about government's plans from my personal observations, but some of the departments, most notably the Department of Transport, they have a strategy in place. So they've got the Green Transport Strategy, and that does point towards encouraging EVs in South Africa. We find, though, that unfortunately the strategy lacks concrete planning, a definitive plan to move forward on. And we also find that there's other departments that have conflicting priorities. So government appear to be somewhat reluctant or hesitant to incentivize EVs to drive this market. And we've seen how critical this is to successful adoption of the technology in other countries. So unfortunately, we're not seeing a lot of movement in terms of this or a lot of intent from our government.
Thank you so much. Hitton, I have a question for you around lithium batteries. What is the lifespan of these batteries used by EVs, and what are the possible engine maintenance issues?
So I think, just speaking in relation to the OEM's offering on that, I think, conventional petrol and diesel vehicles is typically 5-year warranty on everything around that. But I think with most manufacturers, the battery itself within battery electric vehicles provides up to 8 years warranty on that. So that, again, gives the confidence in the technology as well as support to the consumer in that aspect. There's also the question and aspect around second life use of the vehicle batteries. In essence, once the battery is retired from the vehicle, it then can get repurposed for alternative uses, either as home storage or all the way up to utility scale storage of those batteries. And then obviously the battery in the vehicle is then replaced around that. And what's also important to note is that we're seeing a radical change in the battery technologies. A typical example is the BMW i3 that was introduced in South Africa in 2015. I mean, that was introduced with a 60 amp hour battery, and now the recent model is a 120 amp hour battery on the same vehicle. So we're seeing technology radically improving on that context. From a user perspective, there is actually very little maintenance on electric vehicle. Your typical operating costs are very low in terms of charging, in the region of 20 to 30 cents per kilometer for charging electric vehicle, where it's over 1 rand for a conventional petrol and diesel vehicle. And then on the maintenance cycle, you've obviously got less of the components in the traditional vehicle. Your traditional replacement in the question of your filters, your exhaust systems, your other maintenance is really reduced on electric vehicles. So your total cost of ownership really speaks to a pro-consumer in terms of that. So really, it is from a running cost perspective, really supportive on the consumer from that perspective, not forgetting the exhilarating experience that you have from driving electric vehicle.
Thank you so much. Brian, we have a question for you, which is whether assembling EVs in South Africa is a variable option in the future. South Africa's vehicle is huge, and can those assembly plants be adapted to EV cost effect?
Yeah, that's a key point. The local manufacture is a major industry and one of our major export contributors to the economy. And it's key that the local market mirrors that of the global markets to which we export, so that the product profile produced in these local plants matches the export product profile in order to make the plants efficient. So it's entirely possible for us to manufacture EVs in the future. It is dependent on the feasibility of local production or partial production manufacture, and it is also dependent on the local plants securing those production orders. In other words, the products or the model ranges which are manufactured locally are for export and for local consumption, and that's hybrid or full EV or ICE makeup of that model range will be based on global demand. But most definitely from an industry point of view, that is what we want to caution against, that unless we move towards EVs, we actually put our future manufacturing footprint at risk.
Thank you so much. Nick, I have a futuristic question here. And how do hydrogen cell-driven EV and battery EV compare, and which is better?
Okay, as that battle stands right now, I would say EV is winning that race. As the existing infrastructure and battery technology, which is obviously linked to the volumes because of that need for those types of batteries, has made exposure and market penetration much more easier for electric vehicles. It's a very similar story to the many technology rivals of the past, such as VHS versus Betamax, or whether you prefer Apple or Microsoft. So even though the energy density is significantly higher with hydrogen, and I mean significantly higher, it's close to about 40,000 watt-hours per kilogram, to get this fuel manufactured, whether you're going to do it by electrolysis, etc., and then storing that energy and then transporting that energy is very costly. And eventually, when you do these efficiency studies from start to end, you find that your fuel cells and hydrogen comes in at about 35% efficiency versus electric vehicles, and this is the assumption that it's been, from the point of supply, it goes to about 75%. Now, you can argue whether the present point of supply in our networks is renewables, and ideally that's what you want. You want a full renewable solution providing this energy. But if it is going to be a mixture of coal and other conventional generation sources, then obviously that's not going to be as efficient. But we all know that battery will evolve even further, and the latest breakthroughs have happened within solid-state batteries, which is now doubled the energy density to up to about just under 500 watt-hours per kilogram. So it's still early, and a lot of companies are investing. Japan has suggested that they want to go the hydrogen route with very, very plans. They are looking at 40,000 vehicles on their road by 2020, and an astounding 800,000 vehicles by 2030. So we'll have to just watch and see how this plays out.
Thank you so much. Daryl, we have a question around Eskom, and as you know, it's something that is trending at the moment. Do financial problems at Eskom and grid reliability issues make EV adoption in South Africa a challenging prospect?
it would be naive of us to say that Eskom's issues or concerns in terms of its financial performance, and as I said earlier, on technical performance as well, would not have an effect on EV adoption in South Africa. As I said in my opening statement, that we get questions around these things often, and it's a concern for people. So ideally, we really would like to have a stable supply from Eskom that we have no concerns with. But these sort of problems are certainly not insurmountable. It should not, as I pointed out earlier on, get in the way of EV adoption in South Africa. And as the market grows, we will be looking at other solutions that include PV generation, renewable energy generation, and incorporating that both into the grid and to allowing for that at charging points and so on as well. Obviously, storage solutions and so on also need to be considered at the same time. But it does definitely have an effect. But Eskom is working hard on this at the moment to try and bring itself back to the point of stability, both for our economy and for our customers.
Thanks so much. Nick, we have a question around the market in the SADC region. So what role can South Africa actively play for SADC and by extension the sub-Saharan Africa to ensure that we do not have an isolated, thriving EV and smart grid ecosystem, especially in terms of infrastructure?
Nicolette, as it stands, we have a very, very high electrification rate in South Africa. I think it's very close to 97% at the moment. Yet, sub-Saharan Africa, we're looking around 17%. So obviously, there's a challenge in our other African countries and our neighbors. So in terms of electrification and universal access to electricity mandate, that's Eskom's mandate. And within research, we are trying to look at different ways of getting the power to the people, but not using traditional transmission distribution networks. So I believe that microgrids can play a very, very important part in this new energy landscape, where you have distributed generation at specific points rather than a huge network of interlinked grids. But the latter also applies. I mean, if you're going to be challenged with trying to get electricity to these points, then I believe that electric vehicles are going to be very, very far from that. Those two don't normally come together at the same time. So I say our plans right now in terms of SADC is how do we electrify it and get that electrification rate up. And obviously, as soon as you uplift communities and uplift people, the technology will follow.
Thank you so much. I have a question for Hiten. And this is, do you see local manufacturing market transitioning to EV production, or do you see them maintaining the current ICE production lines for export to the developing markets in the world where EV adoption rates are slow?
Yeah, so part of the introductory slide highlighted earlier on the macroeconomic impact of uptake of electric vehicles in South Africa. Part of that work done looked at the existing automotive sector, which contributes to 7% to GDP. And again, that policy framework of the APDP is reliant on supporting internal combustion engines. But that macroeconomic study highlighted that if South Africa is expected to lose its principal markets of export, being the EU, which is 60% of the vehicles we manufacture export to the EU, and we are expected to lose those principal markets because European countries are banning the use of internal combustion engines from as close as 2025. So with that, it highlighted that this is one of the threats to the automotive industry. While the initiatives of the OEMs are trying to focus as Africa as the next frontier to then push ICE vehicles that we manufacture into Africa, the context of driving and protecting maintaining our automotive manufacturing base needs a policy reform to then try and look at incentivizing and maintaining our status within automotive manufacturing towards moving to the likes of electric vehicle manufacturing. In light of that, if we speak on the African context, Africa is endowed with minerals that are being supplied into the global markets that are benefiting EV production. So we need to take a holistic viewpoint from Africa and say there's an opportunity to industrialize and drive EV manufacturing on the continent, not only to supply our emerging cities on our continent, but also supply international markets from new technologies such as EVs.
Thank you. We also have a question around safety of EVs, and I know that this has come up in the news as well. The safety aspects of EVs on the road. How do you ensure that visibility and visually and hearing impaired can be alerted to the presence of these vehicles? And Brian, if you would please respond to that.
I think there's no easy answer to that. Fundamentally, there's a responsibility on the part of the driver and a responsibility on the part of the pedestrian. And the pedestrian shouldn't jaywalk, and they need to look left and look right and look left again. And jokes aside, in our existing environment, it's critical that pedestrians are alert, and it just becomes even more imperative when quieter cars are more frequently amongst us. From a driver point of view, the same principles apply. Defensive driving, driving within limits, being alert to what's on the side of the roads, to what's ahead. All of those principles apply to our current cars. The fact that the cars are quieter just makes it much more relevant and much more important. And I think it's something that all of us need to just become aware of. There has been talk some time ago in some of the US markets around fake sound. Personally, I'm not a fan. I think the fundamentals of safety is really the thing that's going to save us all.
Thank you so much. We've had a lot of questions coming through and a lot of interest from the pre-registrants as well as live audience. However, we are running out of time. I would like to ask each of our presenters to give a very short closing statement. And Brian, if you would please start.
I think the outcome is that the development of EVs is an exciting one in that the products are really those which offer great benefits to drivers. They are more economical to run. They are fantastic to drive. We would really like to see the South African market keep abreast with global trends. That will secure our future as an investment destination, as an export originator, and it will be great for the consumer to keep pace with the rest of the world. And let's come back to the reason for electric cars: reduce greenhouse gases, better air quality, and this climate change thing that is very real, and we need to address that.
Thank you so much, Brian. Daryl, if you would please give your last thought to the audience.
Thank you. Yes, I believe as a nation we can either embrace this technology and all of the opportunities that go with it, or we can put the brakes on, as we currently see from various quarters. But we need to make a decision, and I believe the decision would be to go actively towards the solution. Because I think there are a lot of benefits, both environmentally and other, for South Africa. If we don't, I think we're just going to fall further and further behind the international trend, and eventually it's going to be a painful transition rather than one that really benefits us.
But very clear message that you have given there. Nick, could you please give your final thoughts?
Okay, I believe, EVs, whether they're going to be plug-in electric vehicles or plug-in electric hybrid vehicles, they all will play a very, very important part in this new energy landscape. So the smart grid will have to learn to manage these new technologies. And as a country, and as we move forward, I believe that this aspiration to offer smart grid is now becoming a reality. And as a utility, I firmly believe we need to make a disruptor work in our advantage and make the best of the situation.
Thank you so much, Nick. And last but not least, Hiten, if you will please give us your final thoughts.
I think the future is electric. It's given. We all need to collaboratively, both private sector, public sector, and the consumers, work together on how we fast-track that within South Africa. There's certainly positive benefits to all in terms of embracing and driving electromobility introduction into the country. And we each have a role to play. And I think collectively we need to drive the conversation, drive the activities and action going forward towards achieving where we need to go as a country, both for the benefit of all within that.
Thank you so much, Hiten. My thanks goes to our 4 guest speakers for giving of their time today and knowledge around the EV market, and to you, our listeners, for tuning in today for this live broadcast brought to you by ESI Africa, an African utility week in Power Gen Africa, taking place on the 12th to the 14th of May in 2020 in Cape Town at the CTICC. Thank you so much for tuning in, and goodbye.